So for those who don't know me, my name's Adrian Appo. I'm the CEO of Equity Health Solutions. And Equity Health Solutions is a very new company, and we were established really around the purpose of working with Aboriginal communities and organisations to identify and address health issues, and more specifically those health issues that weren't being funded. And in our short life, what we've been focusing in on is working with AMSs, the medical services, around improving their clinical practice, especially around that complicated system of Medicare claims to build better sustainability. We've been working with corporates around how they better engage with Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal peak bodies and entities. And more specifically over the last bit is we've been actually working on how do we actually build the infrastructure capacity in communities, and Apuna Pima is one of those that we've actually been working with just recently, and they came to us with a thing around medical storage facilities, the need in the Cape in those remote communities, and so we worked on a process of developing or co-designing facility with them. We then were given the job of actually going off and securing the funding for those facilities, and very shortly we will be managing the build and then the installation of those facilities into 3 communities in the Cape. The other thing is that while I was there, I actually ran into an Aboriginal nurse, one of your colleagues, Rochelle Pitt, who I'm sure quite a few of you know. I can see a few heads nodding there. And of course, she had this conversation with me that kind of went like, hey brother, if you really want to make a difference in this space, have a look at renal. And so at the moment, what we're actually doing is doing a model design on how do you actually put renal clinics into communities rather than take community members out to actually get their clinical service. And very shortly we'll be actually doing that, and an extension of that is how do you then get Aboriginal nurses trained in renal so that they can actually be working in their own communities. So that's kind of a bit of a short a snapshot of equity and why we're actually, we've decided that, this is a powerful thing that we should be involved in and supporting and sponsoring. The other thing is I'm not, from the health fraternity, so to hear my brother over the other side there saying that he was in nursing 30 years ago, I think, wow, that's amazing. And so I've only really had, probably 18 months, working in Indigenous health. And one of the things that I've actually learned, if you really want to find out what is needed in community and what is the necessarily thing that patients are actually requiring, you need to talk to nurses, because they're the ones that are actually engaging more hands-on with the needs of Indigenous health than any other person that's operating in the sector. And so that's why Equity is very proud to actually be involved with the National Katsanam conference. And it's also that I actually have the pleasure as a Garangarang man from southeast Queensland of not only paying my respects to the Eora Nations peoples on whose land we actually meet, and the Gadigal people, but also to introduce our next speaker. And I was actually given the thing of, Professor Papaarangi Reid, and I'm thinking, well, who is this? And so if you, like me, you actually Google and I have a look and say, oh, she heads up a department of, the University of Auckland. Wow, that's really cool. She holds science and medical degrees. I think, wow, that's really interesting. But then I was explained and introduced me in terms of, well, she was actually, when I was saying, well, who is she? And then they were actually saying, well, she's a powerhouse in First Nations health. And that actually really made me sit down and think, wow, this is someone that I really want to listen to. So join me in welcoming Professor Reid to the stage.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. Tēnā koutou katoa. I would like to also pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, the traditional guardians of this territory on which we meet. I'd like to acknowledge their long-standing relationship with these lands and that remain unceded. I also acknowledge the keepers of traditional knowledge and wisdoms, young and old, past and future, and I celebrate their courageous leaders, past, present, and into the future. He mihi mai oha tēnei kia rātou. So I'd like to introduce myself. Ko waia hau, who am I? My mountain is Tarakeha. My water is a harbour, Hokianga, Whakapau Karakia. My ancestral canoe is Tinana. My tribal grouping is Te Rarawa, and I'm from Taumaui, the subgroup within there. My traditional meeting house is Mātihitihi, and my family name is Papaarangi. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the privilege of inviting me to spend some time with you yesterday and today, and to hear the inspirational speakers. It's very dangerous to come here, and I was invited to talk about our experience, and I want to differentiate that from trying to tell you guys what to do. So I humbly offer some advice around, or some reflections on our experience rather than big noting what we do in our institutions. Secondly, I totally agree with the leadership shown from the nursing profession, and it's doubly dangerous if you've got a medical degree to come into the room and think you're flashed in front of a whole lot of nurses. And I have enough in my family, nurses and midwives in my family, to quickly put me in my place in that regard. So I agree to, and I acknowledge your leadership. Yesterday, I talked about the curriculum as a garden, and I said that we should look at, in our institutions, where Indigenous health is in the curriculum garden. And I joked that it was usually a small spot at the back close to the compost. And sometimes this is the only place there's natives in the garden. Actually, in some places there's no natives, even in the Indigenous health part of the garden. But sometimes it's the only place there's natives in the garden. And I want to reflect on that, because sometimes we have to acknowledge that westernised models of health do have at their heart colonial ideologies and assumptions of white superiority, and that we have to face up to that. What I noted yesterday was if the little dark spot in the garden is where Indigenous health is taught, this is precious, because the rest of the garden teaches the status quo, and the status quo, as already been pointed out this morning, teaches inequity, and it teaches inequity that's measured and felt by Indigenous bodies. So we are important not to be circumscribed and not to be the only place there's natives in the curriculum. I asked yesterday, are we integrated within the garden, or are we just decorative when it comes to accreditation usually? Is the garden, is the curriculum still a curriculum that delivers inequity? One of my aunties, who always used to nag me, her favourite saying was, if we always do what we've always done, we're always going to get what we've always got, which is one of those prosaic sayings, which takes you about a year to work out what she means, that aunties will often tell you about. And I guess in respect to our curriculum and our work in training, Auntie Waireti was telling us we really have to take over the garden, because if we're just a decorative or performative part in the garden, we are still going to get what we always got, which is the health status of Indigenous peoples internationally, which is inequity and injustice. So the other thing we noted yesterday was we've got challenges. Someone said the R word, racism. The challenges we have with exotics in our garden. We've got noxious weeds. Sometimes they're students, but often they're our colleagues in the profession. They're our colleagues and academic colleagues. We have to wonder if, as Indigenous people within the curriculum, we're sustainable. Are we growing our workforce? Are we safe? Is it safe for us to be Indigenous people teaching our curriculum within a colonised garden? Are we comprehensively integrated and growing another Indigenous workforce? Does the gardener, it's already come up this morning, the gardener needs to be culturally safe. Does the gardener know the importance of the people on whose land the garden exists? So that's my metaphor for you that I used yesterday. I've got a few others today, but I just wanted to catch up on some of the things. I said yesterday that I'll talk more about cultural safety today. And I said that I teach cultural safety, but I don't teach it in Indigenous health. That's a little bit of a lie. It's a little bit of an exaggeration. And I'll explain that further in a minute. We believe that cultural safety overlaps with Indigenous health, and therefore there's an overlapping part of our curriculum. But as part of taking over somebody else's patch in the garden, I teach cultural safety within the professionalism part of the garden. Thank you, Royanne, for mentioning my good friend, the late Dr. Irihapiti Ramsden, who was a public health nurse by profession, and she was on the New Zealand Nursing Council, and she was irritated when the standards were being developed and they kept talking about clinical safety. And in her experience, why she was irritated, and she was a very dangerous woman when she was irritated, she was irritated because everyone was going, in her experience, the thing that where nurses were most dangerous, where actually health professionals were most dangerous, was when we were not when we were clinically unsafe, but when we were culturally unsafe. They wanted to use words, when she raised this issue, they wanted to use words like perspectives. And she said, how come you guys get reality and we only get perspectives? And she was very clever with her English language, and she used to just be able to them enough to make them change. And she came up with the concept of kawa whakaruruhau, which she translated as cultural safety. And she insisted, as being part of the council, that cultural safety became elevated to be as important as clinical safety in the outcomes of nursing and midwifery training. Now, I'm quoting work that she had in her thesis. Even though the war of cultural safety in New Zealand came earlier than the 90s, as you noted, it came in the 80s. So I'm quoting 3 elements of cultural safety she talked about. She said the first part was cultural awareness. Interestingly enough, she talked about it's when we start to become aware and understand that there's a difference between us and our patient or others. Now, this concept of cultural awareness, I think, has been colonised and taken on a different meaning now. She is very much, in her definitions, she's very much in the self-reflective mode rather than the knowing about somebody else mode. So see, she says, it's when we start to have an understanding that there's others are different to us. It's not about, I'm starting to understand you, different person. And that's, unfortunately, is where we're going now. And she even felt it within 5 years that it had been captured, and most people had thought that getting a cultural awareness was going to have involve ritualised training and what some people have rudely called it in Australia, Aborigines 101. And we do have that in New Zealand too. So she said, rather than that, it is the beginning of cultural self-awareness rather than cultural awareness of others. Her next phase, she said, on our journey as health professionals was cultural sensitivity. And that was not being sensitive to others who are different, but actually being sensitive to the legitimacy of others who are different. And what that means to me as a power bearer, what it means to us as health workers who are very powerful in the health relationship. So her cultural sensitivity was not being sensitive to others, it was being sensitive to the power we hold and what does that mean in the way in which we deal with others. And cultural safety, she felt, was the pinnacle of this, and it was when we enabled the patient and family to be able to share power or lead power in that relationship. And that's really quite forward-thinking, that back in the 80s and 90s, she was talking about the other R word that my students are. They used to be, a decade ago, when I say the R word, they'd think I was talking about racism. Now the feared R word in our curriculum is reflection. And most students I know just roll their eyes back in their head and look at their pineal gland as soon as you say the word reflection. So they're no longer scared of racism. So what happened was a big scrap happened. A non-Indigenous student got failed in the cultural safety module in a nursing program, and all hell broke loose. And it went from the newspapers to Parliament. It's written in Hansard's, the parliamentary minutes, about this. Ihapati was vilified in the newspaper, and they took photos of her, and in every photo of her, she went like this. And it was great. She never looked weak for 1 minute. She said, no, you're wrong. But still, the space got captured and colonised because we were all, as health professionals, we were all too freaked out at the ability of us to share power with our patients. And so two approaches started to become obvious in New Zealand, but also in the literature. And so there's two approaches that are slightly different. The first, I would say, would be the acquisition of skills and knowledge to better understand people of different cultures or people who are different from ourselves. And that is either the soul or part of the teaching and learning in cultural safety or cultural competency in New Zealand. The second part that's probably more evolving and probably getting stronger is having a deep understanding of oneself as a health professional and the power that we hold with this understanding, and creating a safe space to encourage patients and family to create conditions where patients can either heal or die peacefully. And that's quite a radical change. But somewhere in there is the self-determination that Professor West talked about this morning. So yesterday I spoke about what we teach in our Indigenous health curriculum and where it overlaps a little bit with cultural safety. I just want to reiterate a few things from yesterday, that we start by teaching before Pākehā came to our country. We start with acknowledging Indigenous science, that we weren't empty vessels just ready for Western science to come along and tell us how it is, that we did have strong Indigenous health business. We had Indigenous ways of knowing, and we had Indigenous ways of creating new knowledge. I gave these two examples. My father taught me what to do if I had a cut, to use a cobweb, long before I learnt about the clotting cascade in physiology, but probably effective and widely known internationally as an Indigenous medicine. He also taught us about the karaka berries, the orange berries, which when eaten are poisonous, but you have to treat them in a certain way with lots of boiling, changing the water, steeping and soaking in running water to get rid of the toxicity. Again, a recognition of Indigenous research, of Indigenous ways of finding things out. So it wasn't necessarily a randomised controlled trial, but it was still Indigenous research and Indigenous knowledge development. So we start by making sure that our students understand that we come from a scientific tradition, not once we're warriors, but once we're scientists. We teach them about the now, and strongly about the now, about inequity. We teach that in terms of breaches of human rights and Indigenous rights. We teach it that the flip side of inequity is white privilege. It's not so much about how bad are Indigenous people, but actually how non-Indigenous people are taking a greater proportion of the resources in our country. We teach about how to be a good New Zealander. Sadly, our education system did not do this, and we find that we have students who have never read the Treaty of Waitangi, who don't know when it was signed. They don't know when our country was formed, if you believe that. So they've never been on a marae, so they don't know how to engage. They're silent. They don't know how to engage with 15 to 20% of our population, and they're ahistoric in terms of New Zealand's history. And so there's a lot of work to be done there. We're looking forward to 2022 when the new government says we're going to start teaching New Zealand history in all our schools. We also teach Indigenous health with a lens to the future, that the current planetary climate crisis will actually increase inequities if we don't intervene, and that most of the commonly mooted ways of managing the climate crisis do not take into consideration that they will increase vulnerability and marginalisation amongst those who are already more marginalised. They don't take into consideration the role of Indigenous knowledges in possible solutions. Like has already been mentioned, we want to focus on underlying issues. We recognise that possibly 50% of the health gap has its basis in inequities in the social determinants of health, and we want our graduates from our health programs to be advocates for changing those social determinants of health. It's while health workers are complicit in the gap, maybe 15 to 20% of the gap, relates to the way in which our health system's organised and our health workers do our jobs. We as health workers do our jobs. The large proportion of the gap relates to the unequal distribution of the resources of our society. And we believe if we want health equity, if we want health justice for Indigenous people, then we have to train graduates to be part of the solution, to be advocates for social justice. And when Sir Michael Marmot was last in Australia, he was interviewed in a bit of a scrappy interview on TV. He said, the solution to poverty is not money, it's justice. And I thought, that's quite a good quote, so I popped that in. So getting back to this dialogue, so that's what we do in the Indigenous health part of the curriculum. How do we try and take over that make cultural safety, take over that professionalism part of the garden? We do see racism and coloniality as dominant isms, but there are other axes of evil or discrimination that are important. I think more and more as I get older, there's ageism, there's ableism, there's a whole thing called fatism now. And we have, a very vocal issue about sexual orientation and gender diversity issues in our community at the moment. So we see the isms, if I can call them that, ableism, sexism, racism, blah, 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 as being the important stuff that we have to cover in cultural safety. And while we are personally pretty invested in racism as the case study that we should teach our students to deal with the isms, the solutions will still be the same in terms of a critical understanding of the power differentials to be able to deal with the other isms. So how do we go about talking about this? So in Indigenous health, we do teach what I would summarise as being how to be a good New Zealander. New Zealand history, basic protocols, and it does reflect the education system failure and denial of our history. But in that work, and this is all sort of happening in the Indigenous health curriculum, in that work, we work really hard to stop stereotypes, that this is what a Māori's like. To stop essentialism, that to be a good Māori, you have to be able to play the guitar. And authenticity, that you can't be a real Māori if blah, blah, blah. So we have a struggle. We even have some of our own policing what it is to be Indigenous. So we try and say, we come in all shapes, sizes, colours. We've got all different histories of colonial histories of being taken away from families, histories of being needing to leave traditional homelands and losing touch with your culture. We don't want to victim blame students who might come into our programs knowing not much about their community because they were adopted or because their grandparents made decisions not to pass on knowledge. So our role is to help create conditions where they join up again and re-strengthen those things, rather than saying, you're not a good enough Māori. Our favourite, Moana Jackson, probably our favourite thinker, Māori thinker, says, you can't be half a grandchild. So he rejects the fact that we should say you're a quarter Māori or you're a something, or this fractional stuff. You can't be half a grandchild. You are either a Māori, no matter what your fraction is. And our role is to make you the best Māori health professional we can. So we would say that being a good New Zealander is sort of what we mean when we say cultural competence for Māori, but we really need to get onto what is cultural competence when you're working with elderly people. So again, this slide I showed before, the acquisition of skills to better understand members of other cultures or other ages or people who are different from you is, I would say, what we would now call, and this is just we in my institution, in my department, you know, not generalising, would call cultural competence. And we really want to move into this other space that Ihapiti designed and that New Zealanders have been allergic to for a long time, and that is cultural safety. So for us, cultural safety is cultural competency, but it's more than that, okay? It's also having an understanding of power and critical self-reflection. And in that, we ask our students to explore their biases. And you've heard a lot about unconscious bias, probably. We don't like the word unconscious. It means something in health. We're not unconscious when we're being biased. We call it implicit and explicit biases. So this is a slide I borrowed from my colleague, Dr. Jones, who's very much into looking at the man in the mirror. And he believes this is what we as health professionals need to know ourselves and identify and reflect on the nature and strength of one's biases and stereotypes. We get our students to look at the implicit association test, and there's the website there, and it's a tool that looks at automatic responses to demonstrate how your conscious and unconscious diverges, and how actually when we think we're in a conscious decision-making situation with our patients, often our unconscious biases start to run the show. I just want to go back. So I usually, when I'm teaching this, I ask the students to go on the Harvard website and to look at, you can take these little tests, and to do these tests based on sex, so gender, age, and body weight. And they all look at race, ethnicity, because I was the teacher, and they're trying to prove to me that they're not racist. And anyway, I'm going, no, this isn't about me. I'm not even going to look at your results. I don't actually have access to the Harvard website results page. It's actually about you, finding out about you. And it's actually teaching them the first thing about self-reflection is being curious about yourself and wanting to find out about your foibles and your faults and your bits of the world where you're a bit one-eyed. And yeah, and get over the fact that you're not trying to tell me I've done it myself and I know where my problems are. And yeah, luckily I don't see patients anymore. That's all I can say for old white men. Anyway, the other thing that's really exciting in the literature now is that there's more and more evidence coming about what do we do about these biases, and we can actually, there are some de-biasing strategies. How do we train people to mitigate their biases, and individuation, there's a number of stuff in the literature now. But a challenge is to modify the work environment, because one of the things that activates our biases are workplace things like multitasking, hello, having to make a decision quickly, hello, I can't remember the other two just offhand. That'll teach me not to make a slide of them. But they're all things which are absolutely prevalent in our workplaces as health workers. Having to make a decision, yeah, anyway, I can't remember. And so very few of these, an issue is that the interventions are focusing on individual change, and very few of them are focusing on societal change and change in the health structures, okay? Changes in the work environment. And we don't have very many examples of people willing to give up power, probably ourselves included, in the clinical relationship. So our challenge in Aotearoa is that cultural competency is in our legislation. So yeah, probably it was part of the rejection of cultural safety out of fear and back in the day, but cultural competency is in our legislation, and we're cultural safety is in the Nursing Council regulations and accreditation standards, and in most of their curricula, but it's not in the legislation that holds people accountable. The other thing which is happening at the moment, I don't know if it's happening for you guys, but there's like 1 million definitions, and it's almost like the institutions are saying to us, oh, you guys have got so many definitions, would you just go away and make one definition, and when you've come up with a singular definition, we'll think about embedding it in our... And so here they are, I'm going, that smells like setting us up for a scrap amongst ourselves so that we don't focus on the fact that they're not making any changes. So this is a... what's wrong with multiple definitions? Just asking. Anyway, so I think we've got a perfect storm at the moment where we've got a bit of an issue happening where there's multiple definitions and we don't know what to do with them. And we should probably celebrate them and think how fantastic it is that so many people are thinking broadly about this issue. But instead, we're getting a little bit paralysed by the fact, and I think that's I could run my, my theory that people are out to get us, but maybe I shouldn't. But I do think that we're a little bit paralysed by the fact that we've got quite a few definitions and we don't know which one to go with, and institutions are using this as a bit of an excuse to do nothing. So are we being encouraged to scrap amongst ourselves about a single definition? And are we being encouraged, especially with the debiasing stuff, to focus our gaze inwards on individuals rather than making important changes or insisting on important changes in the workplace, in our the way in which we do our work, and the societal structures and the health structures. So I really want to know how committed are our institutions. And this is my favourite saying that I learnt from a Māori leader back in the day. And he said, when you look at a plate of bacon and eggs, you know the hen was involved, but the pig was committed. And so I want to know. So I think this is a challenge to our institutions. Are you the hen or are you the pig? Because we really need, and I think it's already been said this morning, we really need our institutions, whether it be academic institutions or workforce institutions, regulatory institutions or research institutions, to move from being involved in this issue to being committed to change in this issue. As I said yesterday, I'm committed to taking up space, one car park at a time, and reclaiming sovereignty. And I think this is important for us to work out, each and every one of us, where is it safe for us to take up space on this issue of cultural safety and Indigenous health in your institution, in your practice, today, tomorrow, this year, and into the future. And I want to pay my respects to what others have already said, that the reason why we're so passionate about this is because this plays out on Indigenous bodies and Indigenous lives. It plays out in our families and in our communities, in our histories, and if we're not careful, in our future. This was a quote by Donna Awatiri, and she said, "I dream of a time when it's safe to be born an Indigenous child." And really, while we are full of hope and while we are committed to change, we are not yet secure in that future. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.